On the outskirts of a pristine community, where order and pristine lawns dictated daily life, stood Crestwood Gardens, a neighborhood seemingly as far removed from chaos as one could imagine. The yards, impeccably manicured, each framed with perfectly trimmed hedges and countless reports of minor grievances, had created an atmosphere of stringent conformity. In this environment, a mere stray dog bark could incite a formal complaint, and failing to adhere to the strict guidelines regarding outdoor decorations was enough to start a feud that could last for months. It was within this tranquil yet oppressive bubble that Carissa Hill sought solace after years of facing the struggles and emotional turmoil of single motherhood. She had battled through mounting medical bills and the isolating nights filled with worry about her son Ethan's health, and when they moved to Crestwood Gardens, it felt like a chance for a new start, a sanctuary from the storm of her life. Although the neighborhood's Homeowners Association, HOA, had a rulebook that seemed to rival a legal constitution in its thickness, Carissa accepted the restrictions willingly. She simply wanted to keep the peace. She had learned through hardship that sometimes the illusion of tranquility was all a person needed. Ethan was just 10 years old, bright and spirited, weaving humor into their lives, even as he faced the reality of living with type 1 diabetes. Diagnosed at 3, the condition dictated their existence, forcing them into rounds of blood tests, insulin administers, and countless calculations for snacks. Carissa had learned to see the world differently, preparing for every outing with meticulous care, each potential disaster averted with preparation and love. That morning, as she packed Ethan's essentials, a sleek black pouch that housed his insulin pen, glucose tablets, and a backup pen, she placed it carefully by the door, ready for their day ahead. But unbeknownst to her, watching from across the street, was Elaine Granger, the self-appointed guardian of Crestwood Gardens. At 55, with a harsh demeanor and zero tolerance for disruptive elements, Elaine had cultivated a reputation as the HOA chairwoman, presiding over the community with a strict eye. Her meticulous documentation of every perceived infraction was a source of pride, and her role as custodian of conformity did little to endear her to the neighbors. On that seemingly ordinary day, Elaine spotted Ethan's insulin case the moment it was placed on the bench. Her sharp gaze narrowed with displeasure. It was an unsecured item, easily visible from the street, a clear infringement of HOA rules that mandated personal items be stored away from public view, citing safety and aesthetic concerns. Without hesitation, and with the certainty of someone to whom compliance was sacred, Elaine crossed the street. Clad in her flawless attire, she approached Carissa's home, grasping the case in an iron grip, not even bothering to knock or ring the doorbell. All she did was reclaim what she deemed a violation, wholly convinced that she was serving the community by restoring order. Moments later, Ethan was outside, returning from a neighbor's house. Carissa's routine preparation had begun to fray as unexpected feelings of dread flooded her. "Mom," he murmured, his voice faltering as he stumbled, confusion washing over his usually bright features. His skin paled as he swayed, and Carissa instinctively rushed toward her son, the panic feeding on instinct. "Ethan, are you okay?" she asked, dropping to his level, alarm rising in her throat. He was falling, nausea blossoming into a full declaration of distress as his body succumbed to the creeping shadows of hypoglycemia. Time fractured as Carissa's heart raced. He needed his insulin now. As she sprinted toward the house, every ounce of fear and desperation fueled her. But when she reached the front door, her world tilted on its axis. The black case was gone. Panic coursed through her veins. Every scenario she could imagine ran rampant in her mind. Then she spotted Elaine standing at the foot of the porch, her arms crossed, the case now her trophy, waving compliance in the air as if to preach the doctrine of order. "What are you doing?" Carissa's voice broke. Disbelief etched across her face. Elaine, remorseless, replied flatly, "It was violating policy. It must not be visible." For a moment, the horror of what was happening crystallized in Carissa's mind, too heavy to bear. Ethan needed that insulin now. "Please," she cried, aware that every second counted. "He's in trouble. Give it back to me." Elaine, unfazed in her convictions, clutched the case defensively. "You should be more responsible with your belongings. It's against HOA rules to leave medication out." There was no softness in her visage, no hint of empathy. Just then, Ethan collapsed onto the grassy expanse, his small body twitching as he gasped for breath, the world narrowing around Carissa into a bubble of despair. "Ethan!" she screamed, rushing to him. With trembling fingers, she fumbled for her phone and dialed emergency services, urgency pressing down like a weight. With every second that passed, hope slipped through her fingers. In that moment of chaos, Elaine stood there, arms crossed, unwavering and indifferent, a chilling representation of someone who had placed rules above the sanctity of life. Around them, the neighborhood watched from behind their curtains, paralyzed in silence. The sirens that followed felt distant, muted against the accusations, guilt, and despair screaming in Carissa's mind. When the EMTs arrived, they rushed Ethan into the protection of their collective skill and knowledge, while Carissa remained rooted on the sidewalk, helpless and frayed. Karen, too close for comfort, shifted her expression only when the first police officer arrived, a meticulous piece of work like Elaine herself, carefully navigating their icy territory. "He attacked me," she declared. Her tone betrayed no remorse, merely irritation, as she gestured toward Carissa, whose hands shook uncontrollably and whose heart ached with the weight of reality. "I was merely enforcing policy." The tension in the air crackled with injustice as another voice broke the chaos. Drew Henderson, a neighbor several houses down, stepped forward, holding up his own phone. "I have footage," he announced, unbending in his stance. The doorbell camera had caught every moment, and he offered the evidence against Elaine's narrative. The footage was damning. Carissa's frantic plea edged against Elaine's cool defiance as Ethan's condition deteriorated, and the silence that enveloped the neighborhood soon morphed into gossip and swelling outrage. Conversations flared on online forums. Debates ignited in homes as residents divided themselves into factions, those appalled by Elaine's actions and those still devoted to her authority. Eventually, Elaine's actions spiraled into a narrative far beyond the scope of simple rule enforcement. They became a rallying cry, consolidating those who were ready to stand against the brandishing of duty that allowed for dehumanizing results. Days turned into restless nights for Carissa, keeping vigil by Ethan's hospital bed, the hum of machines providing an unnerving soundtrack to her life. Each day brought anxiety over physical and emotional effects that stripped Ethan of his youth, threatening to attach complications that would become more than just about survival. Their time in the hospital was prolonged, yet punctured by fleeting moments of joy. Ethan slowly began to recover, lifting his eyelids to see the world through hazy eyes, yet lingering fears remained, fueled by the memory of that day. But as news spread about the confrontation between the perplexing issues of policy and humanity, the growing backlash against Elaine began to morph into a crusade for change. not just for Ethan, but for every child and every vulnerable soul subject to the merciless grip of bureaucracy. It was upon this realization that Carissa decided to channel her anger and heartache into action. Inspired by Ethan's fight for survival, she began drafting a document, a petition to ensure that no one could ever face the same traumatic reality due to a misunderstanding of policies. The Lucas Act, as she affectionately dubbed it, would stand as a covenant for those in her community, an assurance that the sanctity of life noted above regulation would take precedence. The path to introducing the Lucas Act wasn't easy, fraught with bureaucratic hurdles and the burden of doubt from those still shaking in the shadow of Elaine's rule. But each letter of support from other families brought strength, and soon it became a movement that reverberated through social media, gaining traction, momentum, urgency. Municipalities beyond their suburban enclave began to take notice. Other parents chimed in with stories that echoed their own, all steeped in frustration. From mislaid EpiPens to oxygen tanks treated as garbage, they began to band together under the rallying cry of reform. After months of deliberations, testimonies, passionate speeches, and the tugging at heartstrings, Carissa stood before the state legislature, now empowered, now a voice for change. Beside her, on that fateful day, stood Ethan, the embodiment of resilience, proudly displaying a drawing he had made during his recovery, a whimsical representation of friendship with an insulin pen and a heart, embodying what was at jeopardy. As the first iteration of the Lucas Act became reality, hope began to blossom where there had once been fear. As policies began shifting across states and other communities grappled with their own regulations, it became clear a shift had occurred. Elaine's name was still whispered in tight circles, but the focus had shifted towards saving the lives that needed saving, emphasizing that a child's well-being should never be compromised for the sake of rigid obedience. Months passed the initial introduction of the act, as Carissa and Ethan sat together on a newly erected bench in Crestwood Gardens, the sunlight beaming gently down. Warmth spread through her chest, not the best kind of miracle, but recognition. In reconciling with the past and building toward a different future, it felt as though the world had started to listen. The legacy they had created wasn't simply about rules. Beneath it all was the remembrance that people, human lives, required prioritizing over legalistic protocols. In time, the grass became greener around them, the sunsets more picturesque, and the neighborhood shifted toward a new ethos. No more would the plea for compassion be drowned in the tides of indifference. It would become the testament of survival for all children, a moment in which a collective of parental love could further infuse humanity into mundane governance. And when Ethan gazed toward her with a smile, as innocent and genuine as ever, Carissa realized that every moment would amount to something. Every struggle, every victory, every child like her son. And she vowed on that day, with conviction, to never let anyone forget that policy should serve humanity, not overshadow it.